Hello, everyone, and welcome to World Bank Live and to our Resilient Recovery series. I'm Srimati Sridhar in Washington, D.C. Today's conversation looks at economic inclusion, how we can open up opportunities to help the poor escape the cycle of poverty by way of programs and coordinated interventions that aim to boost incomes and assets for the world's poorest. Our discussion is especially timely with the launch of the State of Economic Inclusion Report 2021, The Potential to Scale. The report is a unique collaboration under the Partnership for Economic Inclusion, and it highlights the impact and surge in economic inclusion programs around the world. These programs are on the rise in 75 countries, reaching approximately 20 million households and benefiting nearly 92 million people. But just how do these programs help, and who are the immediate beneficiaries? And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, how has that changed the need and the demand for programs that are designed to better promote economic inclusion? Well, to answer these questions and to talk more about why economic inclusion matters, I'm delighted to be joined by Colin Andrews, Program Manager in the Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice of the World Bank. Colin, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Sri. Thanks so much for the warm welcome, and delighted to be here on World Bank Group Live.
Yeah, well, first off, congrats on the launch of the State of Economic Inclusion Report. I'm looking forward to digging a bit deeper into that and its findings. But before we do that, let's get started with the basics. What is economic inclusion, and why are these programs on the rise?
Thanks so much. Yes, we were delighted to finally launch this much anticipated report. You know, the big idea of this report is, what does it take to transform the economic lives of the poor? As we sit here and as we meet today, the number of people living in extreme poverty is 700 million, approaching 700 million, and it's on the rise. Nobody in the world would have thought that this would have been the trajectory sitting here 1 year ago. And for the first time, we have a generation of people who now face increases in poverty. We had a very nice decline in poverty over the last 20 years, but poverty is on the rise. And what we find for these people who are stuck in poverty, typically we refer to poverty traps. Poverty traps can last generations because people face so many different types of constraints in terms of trying to escape some of these problems. So the report and the idea of economic inclusion programs is really trying to understand how we can enhance the potential of program beneficiaries to escape these poverty traps. The definition, I must say, was a real challenge in the report because there's so much momentum and activity across different types of programs. But as we think about the definition, the idea of these programs is that they give a big push. They are a coordinated set of interventions. So rather than having a standalone cash transfer or a standalone training, what these programs try to do is to bring together a whole package of interventions to support the most poorest, really with the aim of enhancing resilience and also with the aim of enhancing human development. And the great thing about the report is it really tracks this momentum, Shri. Like you just said, we have these programs in over 75 countries. The data is shifting with even more countries because of COVID-19. And we have a range of programs really tackling a number of pertinent questions. So we think, for example, what does it take to lift a female-headed household in Niger, for example, out of poverty, when this woman might face tremendous constraints at the local level in terms of accessing institutions, but perhaps even at the household level in terms of the intra-household dynamics. We think, for example, of what it takes to help a person from Bangladesh, a young man or a young woman with great aspirations, get into wage employment or even self-employment. How we can do this when the realities are that jobs are really not very present and opportunities for formal employment are really not there for many people in this generation. Or finally, when we think of these economic inclusion programs, you might think of people who are displaced in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and how you design these economic inclusion programs to truly think about how you integrate these population groups with host communities and really improve their lot and really to try and improve their own potential. You know, in the end, we see that the landscape, Shri, is really changing. The landscape is expected to change even more with COVID-19 and on top of various challenges like climate change and food security. So we do think that these programs are on the rise, and really excited to be here today to discuss it with you.
Well, Colin, having just defined this for us, let's look at COVID-19. It's been called the inequality pandemic in the sense that existing gaps have been exacerbated by the crisis. So is this borne out by the evidence that you've seen?
Yes, straight off the bat, I think when we started looking at these questions last March or April, it was very, very clear that COVID-19 was not a great equalizer. It really had the most disproportionate impacts on the poorest of population groups. But right off the bat, we also saw some degree of hope and expectations, particularly on the role of social safety net programs and social protection systems that were already in different countries, which provided a mechanism for real-time response and for immediate recovery. But I think you ask a question around what are the different concerns and maybe what are the emerging directions, having been in this scenario now for close to a year. So the evidence, Sri, is really concerning. We know that COVID-19 is exacerbating existing vulnerabilities. So it's falling hardest on most vulnerable population groups, particularly on women. But we also know that COVID-19 is creating new vulnerabilities, particularly in urban areas. We're really concerned by the fact that COVID-19 is taking us off track to achieve some of our major international development goals. And that's a real concern because we were making so much progress beforehand. And there's a huge level of concern in what's happening in informal jobs and informal markets because livelihoods are being cut off, jobs are being cut off. So the COVID pandemic, we don't even talk about adjusting to COVID. It's a question of COVID coexistence and what this means for economic inclusion programs. And at the household, you see all of these global trends and national trends translate into real challenges. Not enough money to cope for health shocks, a loss of income, various pressures and challenges facing different population groups. Let me conclude then by saying where we see some of the emerging directions and where we're a little bit hopeful that economic inclusion can play a response. And it's very important to say that in the report, when we look at these programs, we don't consider them as cathedrals in a desert. These programs really need to be part of an integrated response because governments across the world are really facing a whole load of trade-offs in terms of how they respond to the COVID pandemic. But in terms of where economic inclusion programs fit, we see strong potential, particularly in rural areas. Already, the vast majority of economic inclusion programs are focused on the rural side, and we see very strong connections between the agricultural side and between social protection and various different interventions. And as we go forward and we think about many countries are not really just facing a COVID-19 pandemic, they're also facing a food security crisis, a humanitarian crisis. We see a huge level of opportunity to move forward these programs. And I think of countries like Ethiopia and Bangladesh and respond to that rural dilemma and food security contexts. And very briefly, we've seen this issue of new population groups and the new poor. And there's been a surge of interest now in looking at urban economic inclusion programs. And this is a whole new challenge. It's not just about transferring a rural program into an urban area. There are different challenges in terms of getting to the right population, in terms of understanding that. And we have a huge challenge with migrants and remittances and remittance flows on top of all of this. So within the PEI, we've been doing a lot of work with countries such as Indonesia, Bangladesh, Egypt, Ethiopia, very different countries, but all of them asking the same question: how can we adapt these programs to an urban context? Finally, sorry, I should just say, your starting question was about data and evidence and what we're seeing. This report came out with tracking programs across 75 countries, and just work that we're working on within our team at the moment shows that the bank response alone on COVID-19 and economic inclusion programs has increased, we think, operationally by about 40%. That program caseload is increasing by 40%. So you have existing programs which are recalibrating, but you also have about 15 new countries coming into that mix. So we see that this field is really growing and the momentum will be set to continue.
Well, Colin, from what you're saying here, it would seem that now more than ever, there really is a need for inclusive economic development. So can you describe some of the ways that people in extreme poverty can be helped?
Sure. I mean, this was the big motivating factor for the report. And indeed, this is the big motivating factor for the Partnership for Economic Inclusion. Our partnership hosted at the bank, we work with a whole range of different partners, NGO organizations, UN, research networks. And the big question that we had coming into this report is, well, like, exactly what does this momentum look like? What does the surge look like? And how do you unpack these various different interventions? So we were quite intrigued to understand the scale of these programs. And what we did in the end was we took the data and did a lot of work to understand a couple of things. So let me walk you through the main objectives of these programs, as well as the main components. And I think that's probably very helpful to understand how we see these programs and how they're positioned. Some of the big objectives and the biggest objectives that we were seeing for these programs were really around boosting self-employment and how you can put per population groups into a position to promote micro-entrepreneurship. There's some fantastic work ongoing in Kenya around this. But also, how do you improve wage employment? And I think I mentioned before, in a context where not a lot of economies are formalized, this can be a real challenge because there are not a lot of formal job opportunities. So there's a degree of innovation in terms of thinking how you can connect these agendas. And of course, economic inclusion programs are not a silver bullet. There are a huge degree of discussions and context when it comes to thinking about jobs and job creation in and of itself. But when you come to the needs of the extreme poor, these programs are really largely focused on wage employment and self-employment. In very low-income contexts and in fragile contexts, we also see the translation of those objectives towards looking at income diversification, as well as issues on food security. The bank is supporting a whole range of programs across the Sahel region, for example, which really takes stock to look at how countries such as Niger are trying to adapt these programs, sometimes in the context of fragility, as well as in the context of humanitarian issues and food security constraints. So they would be the big objectives. And then I think at the top of the interview, we said, well, look, what are these programs all about? What are the different types of components? We were really intrigued in the report to understand what these components would look like, both from a government side of government implementation as well as NGO programs. And on average, what we saw was that these programs typically had around 5 different components of interventions, which is a real complex agenda to think about in terms of implementation. So these programs were bringing together cash transfers, in-kind transfers, but also on top of that, and on top of those really big investments, lower cost investments, training and coaching, as well as skills in terms of linking to financial services and market access, which really has the potential to change the life of a program beneficiary. Often you find that people who are in extreme poverty are excluded. They do have these constraints. They don't have access to financial services. They may not understand the technicalities involved in business setup, of course. So these programs are really trying to give you this idea of a big push. Finally, I would be really remiss to say that for those number crunchers and data people out there, we took all of this information from the report and we put it onto an open access data portal. So I'd encourage our viewers to go onto, I think it's PEIglobal_org. I should know that on Twitter, to look at various tweets and links where they can get more information to this data. It's openly available. And we think this is really important to have this open access information.
Thanks, Collins. I mean, so certainly quite a few options and also resources there. Folks, if you're just joining us, welcome to World Bank Live and to our Resilient Recovery series. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, I'm speaking with Colin Andrews, the World Bank's Program Manager within the Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice. The State of Economic Inclusion Report 2021 has launched, which has so far given Colin and I a chance to talk more about why economic inclusion matters, especially amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and as it relates to development. I'd like to continue the conversation now by turning to the report itself specifically. Subtitled The Potential to Scale, the idea is that to reach as many people in need as possible, it's important that economic inclusion programs are government-led. Colin, can you talk to us about some of the challenges, but also opportunities that you see to achieving this?
Sure. Well, again, like this is the big idea of the report. It's also the big idea of the partnership. Traditionally, in the past, we've really benefited from great innovation, especially in the NGO sector, which have really tried to pilot these programs and understand what works and what doesn't work. But now there's a new chapter of the story, and we're really trying to understand what it takes to bring these programs to scale. And I suppose the exciting news of the report is that governments are really taking these programs both at the policy level as well as at the programmatic level to build on existing investments in the area of safety nets, jobs and livelihoods, as well as financial inclusion. And we think all of this, Sri, is really game-changing for a few reasons, because now we're actually seeing that this agenda on economic inclusion helps us. It helps us move onto a national program agenda and position all of these discussions on economic inclusion within the policy framework. We think it's important and it's game-changing because countries and governments are really building on evidence. So this isn't just somebody's great idea, but we have a really solid evidence base to show that these programs are working in practice. And of course, as I just mentioned, we're really looking at this idea of governments adopting and governments taking the lead. So in many cases, these programs are homegrown and that they're really adapted. Now, the big challenge of this report is that despite this massive momentum and despite this surge of programs, where programs are in terms of their coverage, so in terms of their reach across different population groups, that coverage is really quite nascent. We did various calculations, and you could see that when you looked up the programs across individual countries, they could tend to cover maybe 5% or 10% of the extreme poor. And they should never cover the entire number of those in extreme poverty. There are lots of other interventions, but our suspicion is that they could go much further. So the report goes into a lot of detail by bringing together a number of case studies. So we've got great examples from the Sahel region, from India, looking at the Jivika program in Bihar, as well as from Peru, looking at the Haku program, as well as from programs implemented by our partners, such as BRAC, one of the largest NGO implementers in the global south. And despite the diversity of these programs, we see just three challenges that governments are focusing: cost, complexity, and coordination. These programs take a lot of effort to coordinate. This is a massive challenge in terms of bringing sometimes different parts of government together, but also in terms of taking different partners together, whether that's local community groups or whether it's NGO organizations. These programs are complex as well. Sometimes doing one program, doing a cash transfer rollout can be complicated enough without putting additional layers and mechanisms on top. And finally, I think one of the big questions of the report was on costs. We always get the question, what are the impacts? What are the costs? Is all of this effort sustainable? And I think with the report and the contribution of the report, we're actually showing that we have a better handle now on approaching the issues of costing and how governments in particular can move these programs to scale, but also reduce costs at the same time. I think at the end of the day, my final comment on this is the report is a real call to action. It's a real call to action for government scale up. And despite a huge amount of progress, there's a lot of work done, but there's a lot more work to do in terms of working with governments and really pushing this agenda forward at this tipping point in time.
Perfect. Thanks, Colin. We are running a bit short on time here, but let's get to the next question on targeting support. This is obviously very important, and there are two groups that you highlight as being especially important in reaching if we're to tackle persistent extreme poverty. The first is women. Tell us why they play such a key role.
Sure. So, we were really intrigued to see that when we mapped out the various programs within our report, 90% of these programs had a very strong focus on women, a very strong focus on gender empowerment. And this went beyond just a ticked box in terms of including women, but it really tackled some deep-rooted questions. The idea is that in these programs, unless you really try to tackle the power structures, the senses of social justice, many of these gender programs won't really bear fruition. So targeting women becomes a really important part of this discussion by building up in particular issues around skills and confidence of people through through coaching programs and through training programs. Let me give you an example. So one of our star performers in this is the Jewel program in Zambia, a program where the government had invested in cash transfers and are now layering on top of these interventions with economic inclusion strategies. They take a very strong gender focus. So what they end up doing is taking women a lot through livelihood and coaching programs, not just to talk about business support, but also to talk about issues in their household and issues in their lives that they may be struggling with, whether that's child nutrition, or decisions around early marriage. The program focuses on targeting women for this idea of empowerment, but very critically, it doesn't ignore the role of men who are often in these women's lives as a critical influence in decision making. And then finally, when we look at this dual program, we see that there are very specific accommodations in terms of program design and implementation. So making sure that when beneficiaries get benefits in the program, they're meeting sometimes local female community members who are part of the response, or that they're getting special provisions and accommodation for childcare arrangements as well. So we see a lot of work and activity on this front.
Right. And the second group that is also important to target that you mentioned is young people, especially in the informal sector. So how do they matter?
So this is a big agenda. I think that youths represent at the moment approximately a quarter of the global population, and this is getting even larger. So we're seeing governments across the world really looking at the question of jobs, jobs, jobs. Now, this is a big agenda, but when it comes to economic inclusion, there's a real opportunity here to try and understand how this agenda really comes to serve people who are in extreme poverty. So a lot of these programs, like I said, look at trying to boost, in particular, self-employment opportunities. So really realizing that opportunities on the formal side are sometimes absent and may not be available to everybody. And we have some great program successes in countries as diverse as Papua New Guinea and Kenya in terms of governments really trying to understand the adaptations that need to be made to bring opportunities to youth. So sometimes this might be in the form of training programs. Other times it might be in the form of joining public works interventions and learning new skills in that way. Not in the hope that economic inclusion programs become a permanent response, but it provides a pathway to something different and to some new opportunities for these different population groups. And I think almost 60% of the programs that we surveyed in our report had youth as a very strong target group. And we think that in combination with a growing focus on urban economic inclusion, this trajectory of programming is only set to continue to grow.
Great. Well, Colin, as we turn to the last question, very briefly, tell me, when you look forward to 2021, to this decade, to this half century even, what does success look like to you?
Sure, that's a lot of questions there, Shri. Well, look, coming back to the partnership, our vision is very, very clear. Our focus is really on trying to ensure that we can scale up economic inclusion interventions at country level, and that we can scale up these interventions in a way that's affordable, that's cost effective, and also that's impactful. And we're really at the start of that journey. We feel that PEI in this regard is a new kind of partnership. It's a partnership not just working within the bank, but it's a partnership working with a wide variety of stakeholders. And we need this participation to bring these programs to light. So a few things that we'll be doing over the next coming years within PEI. First, our focus is first and foremost supporting frontline country implementation. So really trying to leverage World Bank group financing and leverage partnership to really help improve the capacity for program implementation, and really trying to get these programs to work and to reach the level of scale where they need to be. And second, really trying to enhance the evidence base around the programs. I think, like I said, we have a large amount of information on these programs in terms of how they have worked. We're showing positive and sustained impact. But much of this evidence comes from NGO-led programs. They've been critically important. But we're also seeing a new wave of programming needs and evaluation needs across government programs, and many governments really looking at this agenda to see how they can fill these information gaps. Lastly, just before closing, I think you said what this agenda looks like, in the next 10 years and in the next 30 years. But for our audience today, in terms of thinking of this agenda today, I'd encourage you, please, check out our Twitter account, PEIGlobal_org. Take a look at all of the materials that we have in this report. It's a large report, but we've chunked it down into various animations, into various chapters, case studies, and data portals. So you can really get on here, engage, and join this journey with us. Thank you very much.
That's great. I think certainly much to look forward to. So Colin, on that note, thank you so much for joining me here today on World Bank Live. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you and learning more about why economic inclusion matters as we look ahead.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, folks, that was Colin Andrews, the program manager in the Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice of the World Bank. The State of Economic Inclusion report is now available on our website, so do check it out in full. And the conversation doesn't stop here. If you want to learn more about how the World Bank Group is responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, be sure to check out our website at worldbank.org/coronavirus. And as always, you can tune in to more of our programs or catch up on past discussions, including today's chat, by heading on over to World Bank Live. That's live.worldbank.org. I'm Srimati Sridhar. Thank you again so much for joining us today. We'll see you back here again soon. Take care and goodbye.